The story of oil is the foundational story of the 20th century, its primary motive force. Oil's abundance and power ignited dreams of limitless growth and impossible wealth. The whole modern world took on some of the delirious logic of the boomtown and the gusher, driven by the certainty that there would always be more. Chris Turner, The Patch. In this video, I will discuss the economic and environmental policy challenges of pipelines within the jurisdiction of Canada's federal government. According to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, there are four types of pipelines. Gathering pipelines, which are the small diameter pipelines used to move crude oil and natural gas within producing areas, usually from wells to collection points known as batteries. Feeder pipelines, which move crude oil and natural gas from batteries to larger transmission pipelines. Transmission pipelines are the large diameter pipelines that transport oil and gas long distances across provincial and national boundaries to refineries and international markets. There are also distribution pipelines, which utilities use to deliver natural gas to consumers. Here is an infographic from the Government of Canada showing the different kinds of pipelines and how much there are of each type. For this video, I will be focusing on the large diameter transmission pipelines. So what are the policy problems here? Well, I suggest that there are two. The first is that there is not enough pipeline infrastructure to get Alberta oil to Tidewater. Tidewater just being a colloquial term referring to the coast where oil and gas can be shipped internationally. And of course, unless you've lived under a rock for the past several years, you've probably figured out that climate change is a thing that is happening, and it is very, very bad, which leads to policy problem number two, which is meeting Canada's emissions targets of 30% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. Because Canada is a largely export-dependent economy, it relies heavily on its natural resources to drive economic growth. But there are consequences to developing these resources. According to Natural Resources Canada, Canada is the fourth largest producer and third largest exporter of oil in the world. 97% of Canada's proven oil reserves are located in the Alberta oil sands, making the Alberta government a key player in the pipeline debate. There are an estimated 165 billion barrels of oil in the oil sands, and in order to make a profit and subsequent government revenues from this resource, it needs to be extracted from the ground and moved to refineries. This is where transmission pipelines come into play. According to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, there are three key pipelines in Canada. Enbridge Line 3 replacement, which would add 370,000 barrels per day of oil transport capacity. Keystone XL, which would add 830,000 barrels per day of new capacity. And the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, which would add 590,000 barrels per day of new capacity. These three pipelines alone would account for an increased 1,790,000 barrels per day of oil exporting capacity. As George Hobart puts it, the differential represents billions of dollars per year in foregone revenues to the sector and helps explain the strong pressure to increase access to Tidewater. However, while expanding Canada's oil and gas infrastructure would increase revenues, it would also inevitably increase production and consumption of fossil fuels and perpetuate the cycle of carbon lock-in, keeping Canada's economy dependent on oil exports for decades to come. So my research question, which I think gets at the crux of this dilemma, is how have countries whose economies depend on fossil fuel exports attempted to reduce their emissions, and which policies have been successful in balancing economic and environmental challenges? So for this video, I will be focusing on the key policy developments in Canada and the factors that have influenced those policies. Hoberg says that when pipelines cross provincial or national boundaries, they are under the jurisdiction of the federal government through the authority of the National Energy Board Act. In 2012, the Harper government amended the National Energy Board, limiting its authority to make final decisions on pipelines. The amendment eliminated a federal veto point to the pipeline approval process, effectively making it easier for pipelines to pass through the regulatory hurdles of the federal government. In 2015, Canada signed on to the UN Paris Agreement, committing to a 30% decrease in emissions below 2005 levels by 2030.
Because it's the right thing to do for our environment and our economy as part of the global community.
Despite the upward trend in emissions since 2015, the Canadian government remains convinced that they can accomplish both policy problems of moving Alberta oil to Tidewater and meeting their emissions targets by 2030. The Trudeau government has tried to reconcile Canada's environmental and pipeline infrastructure goals with the controversial Bill C-69, which reintroduces the institutional veto point under the Canadian Energy Regulator. Bill C-69 overhauls the approval process for pipelines under the federal jurisdiction. Section 183, Part 2 of the bill states that the approval process must take into account the immediate and cumulative environmental impacts, the health, social, and economic effects, the interests and rights of Indigenous peoples, potential markets and economic feasibility, and whether the project will hinder or contributes to Canada's ability to meet its climate change obligations. So obviously there are a lot of factors that have influenced pipeline policy in Canada, but for this video, I'm just going to focus on 4 broad categories: the economic interests of corporations and governments, environmental interests, competing ideologies, and Canadian federalism. So the economic interests, which I've already touched on before in this video, are pretty straightforward. Essentially, both corporations and governments stand to make
billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions
of profits from expanding pipeline infrastructure. Then, of course, there are environmental interests. Unfortunately, environmental groups lack the money and access to resources that oil and gas lobby groups have, but environmental interests have gained a lot of traction over the last few years, most notably when Greta Thunberg, the young climate activist from Sweden, was able to mobilize millions of people around the world with her Fridays for Future movement. There's also a lot of competing ideologies at play: neoliberalism, which broadly refers to the demand for economic growth and free trade; climate denialism, which refers to people who either don't understand or choose to ignore climate science. Western alienation is also a major factor, and by that I mean the sentiment that Alberta and Western provinces in general have been somehow left behind or don't have a real say in federal government. And finally, there is the institutional structure of Canadian federalism. So we all know that Canada is divided into provinces, but the way that jurisdictional authority is distributed to the provinces actually has a lot of implications for pipelines and oil and gas. As I mentioned earlier, pipelines that cross borders are under federal jurisdiction, but natural resources such as oil and gas fall under provincial jurisdiction.
What did we get from Mr. Trudeau?
This overlap of jurisdictional authority has created a lot of tension between Alberta and Ottawa. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has challenged Bill C-69 as not constitutional, arguing that it violates Amendment 92A, which states that provincial legislatures have the exclusive rights to make laws regarding the development and export of their own natural resources. However, the amendment also states that Parliament has the ultimate authority. There are several actors who have stakes in the pipeline debate: federal and provincial governments that have to balance the economy, environmental commitments, and electoral incentives; landowners and Indigenous peoples who would be directly affected by potential oil spills; oil and gas companies and their shareholders; lobbyists such as the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers; environmental groups such as the Council of Canadians. I've also included youth and vulnerable populations in this category because they will be the ones dealing with the long-term and more diffuse costs of climate change. For my conclusion, I want to clarify one very important point: the policy problems of pipeline infrastructure and achieving Canada's 2030 emissions targets could easily be framed as a choice between economic or environmental interests. But I don't think this kind of either-or comparison is helpful to solving either of these challenges. Yes, there are
billions and billions and billions and billions
of potential profits to be made, and yes, climate change is a very serious existential threat, not to mention the more concentrated risks of oil spills to local farmers, communities, and Indigenous peoples. But what we need is a more nuanced problem definition that reconciles Canada's economic and environmental goals and weighs diffuse, long-term costs equal to short-term concentrated benefits. And for this, we need not political polarization and false equivalence, but solution-based policy learning. We need to look at similar jurisdictions with fossil fuel-dependent economies, see what works and what does not, and use that knowledge to create innovative new policies that work for Canada's economic and environmental interests. And now, as a consolation for making you listen to 3 different politicians, I will finish with this quote from the great Tim Minchin.
Most of society's arguments are kept alive by a failure to acknowledge nuance. We tend to generate false dichotomies and then try to argue one point using two entirely different sets of assumptions, like two tennis players trying to win a match by hitting beautifully executed shots from either end of separate tennis courts.
The takeaway here is that policymakers need to stop choosing between this and start creating more innovative policies that work within Canadian federalism to mitigate climate impacts and address Canada's economic needs without perpetuating fossil fuel dependency.